Hey. Welcome to episode 100 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Yes, I've been able to do that introduction 100 times now. Today's guest is my 100th guest. It's just amazing to think about. It, have you had this experience before of starting something and not knowing where we're going and suddenly looking back on it and being like, oh, I accomplished a lot there. That's kind of how I'm feeling about Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. It's building. But and what I love, or one of the many things I love about it, is it's not just me building it. It's me who's doing the interviewing, but Chris, who I work with does all the graphics and creates the look of it, and then my guests are really the ones that propel it, and today is no different. I'm honored to have a guest I've known for a long time who has who's done exceedingly important and powerful work throughout her lifetimes her lifetime. And I'm excited for you to hear about it, but first the intro.
Today's guest, Ann Wilson.
Oh, say yay! Let me tell you a little more about Ann. By first saying the more magnificent people I interview on the show, the more I realize that each of us has a unique adventure, a unique journey to go on in life. Dr. Ann L. Wilson is no exception. She grew up in California. After college, she went on an epic road trip across Asia. Doesn't that sound fun? Then settled in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. She's a gifted professor and a steadfast advocate for children and people with disabilities. She currently serves as Senior Research Associate for the University of South Dakota Center for Disabilities and is a professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of South Dakota's Sanford School of Medicine. She does great work, but what she does is create a tongue twister in my mouth. Over the duration of her career, Ann's service has included involvement in American Indian communities, publishing an annual report on South Dakota's State of the Child for several decades, and authoring publications on parental bereavement. When I saw Ann a few weeks ago, she told me stories about the heroes who advocated for the rights of people with disabilities, people like myself. We will talk about all this because it's fascinating, and I love celebrating the vastness of our lives. Please help me welcome Ann Wilson. Woo!
Hi.
Hi, Ann. Thanks so much for being on the show. So did you grow up in the Midwest?
No, I grew up in Southern California outside of Los Angeles.
What was that like?
Well, the San Fernando Valley, which is to the west of downtown LA, was a growing, sprawling community of neighborhoods. After the war, it just kind of continued to spread out, and it didn't feel like a town like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because one neighborhood and one community would just sort of spread out to the next. And we were all part of LA City, but that was a long way away to see where City Hall was. So the sense of community wasn't as well defined as we have it in Sioux Falls. And it was also a time of enormous change for that area. And now we used to go to the top of Topanga Hill, on the top of Topanga Canyon, and my dad would say, well, 4 years ago, the lights went to here at night. And he'd say, and I bet by the next time we come, the lights will be out to here. And I'm sure now it's just glowing in all directions. But I remember that vision of seeing how the lights were progressing further west and north in the valley.
That's amazing. I have another good friend who grew up in Topanga Canyon.
Oh, really? Well, the top of the hill, there was a restaurant. I mean, this was in the 50s and 60s, and we'd go up there and get ice cream cones. That was sort of a family treat, and look out at night and then come down the hill to Woodland Hills where we lived.
Oh, wow. Oh. What are some of your other favorite memories of being a kid in LA when it was growing so much?
Well, it probably is not related to its growth, but my family, as I recall, my grandparents actually had a friend who had a house in Laguna Beach. And we got to stay there 2 weeks a year. I don't know quite what the arrangements were, but it wasn't just Laguna Beach. It was a private part of Laguna Beach called...
No way.
Yeah. I mean, it was little cottages. I mean, these weren't fancy homes. I went back about 10 years ago and was appalled. It looked just terrible. There were big fancy homes that seemed to be shining, but at this time there were sort of little fun vacation cottage homes on streets. Then you walk down wooden stairs down to the beach, and then there were 3 arches kind of, where the water had eroded the rock. And those were wonderful, wonderful times. We got to spend the day on the beach and explore starfish and abalone and go swimming and learn how to ride waves. And we were pretty young at that time, but it was a fabulous memory of summer vacations.
And Laguna Beach must have seemed really like in the country at that point, right?
It was a long, I mean, it was a long, hot drive. No one had air conditioning cars, and it probably wasn't all that long, but it was, yeah, we'd go and remember the Alpha Beta grocery store was on the top of the hill, and they had something that was just remarkable in those days. You stepped on a mat and the doors opened. That was a big deal to have a door open when you stepped on. That was very fancy.
I remember how exciting that was as a kid.
Yeah, that was very exciting. And then there was artsy shops, pottery shops at that point, and places where they sold all kinds of interesting seashells. And there was a funny man that was a greeter. We called him Funny Man, who would always greet people as they approached Laguna Beach. So yeah, it was very festive arriving, and I have fond memories of those days. Actually, though, my siblings kind of chide me for this. It was my bright idea and I can't Yeah. I have mixed feelings about this. But I had this bright idea that I heard that friends at school or people I knew were going on vacations on trips, not just to the beach, but on trips. And so that initiated the family's trips, kind of camping trips up the coast of California, all the way to Oregon, and then once all the way across the country to New York City. And so, yeah, those trips weren't like lolling around on the beach and riding waves, but we saw the country. we saw different geography and places, and certainly broadened our view of the country. But I still remember Laguna Beach and Three Arch Bay.
Three Arch Bay.
Yeah.
Speaking of family, do you happen to know Larry Wilson?
Larry Wilson's my little brother. Yeah.
And this lady?
And my sister Catherine Reed is my sister. Yeah.
Cool. Well, that
Oh, good.
thanks for being here, Anne's family. So briefly, what's one of your favorite memories from your cross country trip to, where did you go? New York City?
Well, right. That first really, we actually kind of, my dad had a conference in New York, but we kind of flew. Yeah, we flew and then drove back. And I think it was just so interesting to see different parts of the country. I love the Midwest, the sense of communities that we experienced. Of course, going up and down the coast of the East Coast to see Williamsburg and Washington, D.C., that was, remarkable. Actually, one of the memories about that trip, which little did I know it would impact my future life, was driving through South Dakota.
No way.
Yeah. And when I first was approached about coming to South Dakota, that memory occurred to me. And it was a very hot day. I suppose it was in probably August or July. And as we approached West River, which we didn't know was West River, I didn't call it that in those days, but there was an incredible sandstorm, and and we watched the trucks, the trailers attached to trucks rock literally back and forth. And when we got to the Holiday Inn out in Rapid City, at that point there wasn't a dome over it, and so the lawn furniture was flying into the swimming pool, and so that was my memory of South Dakota. As I thought,
And you came back?
I did, but I eventually went out to Rapid, and gosh, the furniture can't, it's now covered that part of the hotel. But no, that was my first exposure to South Dakota. And then Mount Rushmore, that was exciting, driving up Needles Highway. I remember doing that. And eventually getting back to California. But in those days, cars weren't air conditioned either. So it was, I think it was a pretty warm trip.
Oh, I bet it was dusty in the car too.
Yeah, we had some dusty trips.
So as you came into your adolescence, what started to interest you?
Oh, yeah, I think I was always taken and admired and felt drawn to those who had a strong inspiration towards social justice and had some commitment towards improving the lives of those who experienced disadvantage. But I wasn't sure what direction that might take me. Certainly towards a service-oriented career. but I wasn't sure. I had no idea. I ended up in college with a sociology major, which is about as broad as life can become as an undergraduate. And that's how it tended to express itself as I was in college.
So after college, how did you end up suddenly having an opportunity to move to Asia?
Oh, well, I'm convinced that some of the most interesting things in life come in the most unexpected ways. And
Let me say that. It's so good. You said I'm convinced that some of the most interesting things in life come in the unexpected ways, or something like that.
yeah, something like that. Um, as a senior in college, I went to Lewis and Clark College, which hit the news sadly just this past week. There was a terrible hammock accident on campus. And
What?
yeah, the president of the university sent all the alum a note, and I guess it was in the national news as well. Students, there was an area on campus where students enjoyed hanging, in hammocks, which has become popular among young people. And sadly, a pole collapsed.
Oh,
Oh, it was terrible. Two students were, it sounds like, pretty significantly injured, and one
oh,
sadly did not survive. So, yeah,
oh,
Lewis and
God.
Clark has been, very
Oh,
unfortunate. Yeah, terrible, terrible. I think it was probably the first week of classes and a brand
oh,
new president. So, poor
oh.
president had to deal with this tragedy on campus. And
Doesn't that make your stomach just sink?
oh, it did.
Oh,
I read this email that I got and sort of told a friend, and she said, "Oh, I already read about that in the news." And then I sent the email to a bunch of young people I know who like to hammock. They probably didn't appreciate the warning. I said, "Please be careful where you hang your hammocks." But
who would think hammocking could be dangerous?
I
It's
know.
so
Well,
strange.
yeah, I know. Just a terrible, terrible tragedy.
Hmm.
But it's interesting. The campus was on an old estate, and this hammock area where students apparently spent time was in a vineyard, an old vineyard, and there was a brick tower or something that they attached their hammocks to. So it's just a terrible
Oh
tragedy.
my gosh.
Yeah. Oh, terrible, terrible. So anyway, I went to Lewis and Clark College. No one died while I was there that I know of.
Where's Lewis and
It's
Clark?
in Portland, Oregon.
Okay.
And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous campus on an old estate that frames Mount Hood. It was actually, as a college, it was fairly early in the game of finding off-campus opportunities for learning. Small liberal arts colleges, sometimes you can use up what's available on campus. And they provided all sorts of opportunities for students to do things overseas very early in the game, and not just going to Europe, but all kinds of third world countries. There were a lot of interesting opportunities for students interested in moving into the State Department or other kinds of work in world affairs. And but one of their off-campus experiences that interested me, I did go to Europe, but was an opportunity to spend a semester at a center that was developed in Detroit by Mrs. Ford from the Ford Motor Company family to study young children's development. It was really one of the first places in the country that had a research interest around child development. And they had one of the first nursery schools actually in the country, which they used for their research interests to study the children in social situations.
Wow.
So I went there and fell in love with early development and took classes. And it was really, I hadn't explored that area and just found it absolutely fascinating. And the other part of that experience that was intriguing is it was originally, the students lived in one of about 6 houses along a street right off the major thoroughfare through Detroit. And at one point in time, that was a very affluent neighborhood, but it had become, with the changes in Detroit, the houses were lovely and well maintained, but a block away, it was downright dangerous and had become a very low income neighborhood that was within a few blocks of where there had been riots about a year and a half before, 2 years before. Terrible riots in Detroit. Actually, maybe it was only a year before. So it was, an experience to live in a very urban area in an impoverished, neighborhood surrounding it.
And you up until that point, you had never had that experience.
No. I lived in the suburbs of LA and then on campus in Detroit, in Portland, Oregon. So, and it was a wonderful living environment because we were all in these houses and we all had meals in our houses. And it was a lovely experience. And then, I loved Merrill Palmer. At 3:00 every afternoon, all the faculty and students would gather for tea and sherry if you were old enough. Yeah, cookies. It was great. I thought this was fabulous, and you get to drink tea with your faculty, and it was a wonderful time. But I fell in love with the subject matter of early development.
And what fascinates you most about that subject matter?
Oh, what was it that fascinated me? Well, this was the 60s, and of course we were interested in environmental influences on development, and how social experiences impacted cognitive development, how nutrition impacted development, and how children's early social interactions with parents and peers played a role in future development, and of course how intervention could make a difference in promoting more positive development. Actually, the tagline for Merrill Palmer, I remember it was on optimizing human development, and that's just an interesting concept. How do we optimize the outcome of human development? And so it was at a time when Head Start, for example, was emerging, and the whole idea that early intervention, I don't like that word intervention, but how early experiences that can be provided in a community can ultimately lead to a more positive outcome in a child's life.
If anyone else has questions or comments for Anne, please chime in. I have plenty, but I'm always glad to hear yours. So please comment if you want to. So how did you get from Detroit to Asia?
That's still the question, isn't it? Well, I graduated from college early and was planning on going into the Peace Corps. That was my first step in life. And I had this idea.
And this is before you went to Detroit, right?
I was going to go into the Peace Corps after Detroit. That was my senior year in college, was in Detroit. I actually graduated after that experience in Detroit. So I was a little ahead of myself.
Oh, you're senior year. Yeah, so the Lewis and Clark provided the opportunity. Okay, got it.
So I was going to go into the Peace Corps. And I always say the Peace Corps understood me better than I did at that point in time. They gave me an assignment that I rejected, actually. And I asked to be reassigned. I'd always dreamed of going to sub-Saharan Africa. That was what I thought would, if you're going to go in the Peace Corps, you want to go into the jungle of Africa. I had sort of this idea. And instead, the Peace Corps wanted to send me to Morocco. And they wanted me to go to Morocco, I think partially because I had a minor in French. I barely stumbled through it, but I somehow had a minor in French. And I'd been in France during my college years. And what they wanted me to do was exactly what I ended up spending most of my career doing. They wanted me to work in the field of maternal and child health, which is where I have found myself. And they were developing community centers, I guess, out in the desert in these communities, for mothers to bring their babies to learn about maternal health and early infant development. I mean, that's exactly what I spent most of my life doing. I mean, that was what I wanted to do. And in that, you know, I don't know why, but, you know, I somehow didn't quite see myself doing that. And in the midst of all of that, and when I was at Merrill Palmer, my practicum experience was in the preschool, and so I got offered this position at the American School in Kuwait teaching kindergarten. So I ended up, I don't know why, but I ended up going to Kuwait instead. And I was with another friend who was offered a similar opportunity, and so off we went. And so I was at the American School of Kuwait. And at that time, no one knew where Kuwait was. Now we all know where Kuwait is because of wars and horrible things. But all I'd remembered was in like 7th grade, a teacher pointing to a map and saying, Kuwait is a country where, you know, there's a lot of oil and people are very rich. And I remember thinking, oh, do I want to go to a rich country? But this school it served the international community, kind of those that were there for diplomatic and other engineering type positions with the oil industry, which really went against, you know, my humanitarian instincts of wanting to be in the Peace Corps. But somehow that happened, and off I went. So,
And you had to explain to everyone probably where Kuwait was.
oh yeah, well, yeah. And interestingly, my dad had spent World War II in Egypt and Iraq, servicing airplanes during the war. And
Wow.
so he knew where it was.
Wow. That's a coincidence.
Yeah. So anyway, off I went. And so once there, you know, there was a community of young people. We were all very young and right out of college and kind of very adventuresome and very naive. And we traveled a lot. You know, we would teach, and then as soon as a vacation came, we'd be across the border, or on an airplane, or we'd be off, you know, doing something that was adventuresome and seeing a part of the world that, quite frankly, now you couldn't see. So as a tourist, you sure wouldn't be seeing it. Maybe in the military you might.
Wow. So you had this golden opportunity to see so much.
Right.
Then how did you come to set off on this 5-week or 6-week journey across Asia?
Well, there were 4 of us, and we wanted to see the world, and I didn't own it, but 2 of them owned a Volkswagen van, and we set off on this trip to Nepal. And so to get to Nepal from Kuwait, you traveled through a corner of a rock, and you know, that was dangerous even then, and traveled all the way through Iran. Yeah, I know. And yeah, we traveled through Iran, went through Mashhad, which, yeah, then, you know, cross Afghanistan, and then into Pakistan. Sadly, an area of Pakistan that today is flooded and is in terrible, terrible condition. We went to India. We went way up to Kashmir, which is now war-torn as well, an area of disputed land way up north in India, where people live on houseboats. It's fascinating territory. Then back across northern India. I bought a dress in New Delhi, a beautiful silk dress in New Delhi, which I wore for the first time a year ago for my niece's wedding.
Wow.
It was a 50-year-old dress that I had never worn. I bought in New Delhi. That's just sort of an interesting story. Then we went all the way to Nepal. We went all the way across and then way up to Kathmandu. And from there, I mean, this was quite the summer. I left my 3 friends, flew back to New Delhi, and then flew from Delhi to London and met up with a group from the University of Pittsburgh. I had heard about the study tour that was available. I signed up for it. And it was a study tour of early childhood programs. I don't know how I was lucky enough to have seen this brochure, but I was. And it was a study tour of early childhood programs in what was known as the Soviet Union. So this was, deep into communist times in the Soviet Union. And so I was absolutely fascinated because we went to these centers for early childhood education that had started with infancy, which really wasn't going on in the US at that time. And the whole approach to providing care to these very young children was molded around how do you provide care to create little communists, little babies that would eventually be comrades.
Wow.
And loyal to the Soviet Communist Party. And so the cribs were all on high stilts so that the adults would always have eye contact with the children, with little babies. And the play yards were full of rocket ships with pictures of Lenin would be all over the rooms, Lenin and Stalin. So, the whole approach was, socialization. But the part that was also so interesting for us was we wondered if we were only seeing the best of the best, but we wandered off and found incredible facilities and camps for children that had had a hard winter with illness, and just gorgeous facilities that were a lot of investment was put into fostering positive development for the strength of the society. So we didn't just go to Moscow. We went up to Leningrad, it's now St. Petersburg, and then all the way south to almost where I began the summer, down in Georgia and Armenia, which wasn't too far from Iran. And so then, then eventually I got back to London and then came on back to Kuwait for the final year of teaching there.
So how did this epic adventure as summer inform the rest of your career?
Oh, who knows? I'm sure in lots of subtle ways. I have a vision of a part of the world that not many people have. In the second summer, by the way, my sister joined me in Kuwait, and we repeated that trip by air, not overland. And then we ended up in Japan. We went all the way and then flew back to LA. But I think I have a vision of the world that, people now can watch TV and see a lot of that, but it was a pretty remote area. Very different social systems. I mean, we saw women behind veils before that was really a common image that other people had ever seen. We saw open air markets. We saw visions of a very simple life, a crowded life. In India, I thought you never could have a view out a window without seeing many people. To drive, we had to barter with men to get their elephants off the road because they'd park them in the middle of the road and pay them.
You literally had to barter with men to get
It was a good money raiser for the local community.
That sounds so exotic.
Yeah, it was. So, and then just the incredible strength required for survival, very, very harsh living circumstances. And, it wasn't easy to travel. It was hot and sticky, and we were often sick from eating food that probably wasn't quite right. And it was, it wasn't easy, but it was sort of like, this is a vision I'll never have again that I want to experience and to know.
So how did you two questions. How did you get to, like, you grew up in California, traveled the world. How did you end up in Sioux Falls, and how did you get interested in the rights of people who experience disabilities?
Well, I went to graduate school in Michigan State because I wanted to be close to Merrill Palmer Institute again, and thought maybe I would pursue some graduate work there, which was available, and then that didn't happen. I was pursuing a degree in early development, and became very, very interested in earlier development and the prevention of child abuse, actually, at the time. I did my dissertation on delivery room observations of mother-baby interactions. I was
Wow.
was very, very interested in the emergence of the early social relationships between babies and parents, and had the opportunity, which so fortunate, to do a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Michigan in infant mental health. And at that time, that was a brand new field. This was now by the mid 70s. And a woman by the name of Selma Freiberg, who was a well-known child psychoanalyst, was developing a training institute and a research institute around how the mental health of an infant was emerging, and how intervention and treatment could foster positive relationships and development for troubled parents and babies. Interestingly, her work grew out of disabilities. And that was because she, again, it was a happenstance for her, had an opportunity to visit a residential treatment, a residential setting for infants who were blind. And they discovered that these babies were far more capable of interacting if appropriate approaches to enhancing their relationships with their parents could be fostered. And so it occurred to them, gee, if we can do this with blind babies, what's going on with sighted babies? And so they developed this whole approach to infant mental health, which was really, it was pioneering. This just had not been done before. And so I was exceedingly fortunate. And I have a lot of feelings of warmth and gratitude for that year at the University of Michigan. Sadly, my mentor has just passed away, and so I feel a lot of sentiment about that year and all that I had learned and gained from my experience in Ann Arbor. So while I was there, I also had the opportunity, and I'd had some previous exposure to others doing this kind of work and having an interest in early infant work that came out of neonatal intensive care, and was introduced to someone at the University of Wisconsin who was a neonatologist but had a broad interest in also promoting the development of babies, not just making sure they survived a rough beginning, but what happens beyond that, because there was a lot of concern at that time that intensive care was interrupting parent-baby relationships, and what could they do to foster that, while at the same time assuring the baby's survival. And he was interested in the work going on in Ann Arbor and connected with me, and it turned out he was moving from the University of Wisconsin to the University of South Dakota to develop neonatal services, and asked me to come along, and I did. And so I moved to South Dakota on Labor Day weekend many years ago, and haven't left. I'm still here. Done a variety of other things along the way.
including working with the Native American communities.
Right. That was a interesting how I fell into that opportunity as well. It all kind of commenced, interestingly, with a trip to my college, Lewis and Clark, where they had brought some alum back. And one of the wives of the faculty said, "Oh, I just finished reading a book that took place somewhere out there where you live." She kind of just waved her hand, and I said, "Really?" And she said, "Yeah, it was about this anthropologist who adopted this child, and it turns out he had fetal alcohol syndrome." And I said, "Well, that's an interesting." She said, "Go buy it. It's in the bookstore." So I did, and I read it coming back to South Dakota, flying home. Discovered that the book took place in South Dakota, and then the book was called "The Broken Cord," and it was written by an anthropologist named Michael Doris. And he described his journey of having adopted a child who seemed to have multiple problems that no one could understand. And it turned out that this child had fetal alcohol syndrome. And then he painted a very bleak picture that no one was doing anything about fetal alcohol syndrome in South Dakota or really anywhere in the country at that time. And so I was pretty impressed by all of this, I was at a meeting and was approached by a nurse in the Indian Health Service. He said, "Why don't you go off? We want to pay you to go off to this meeting to learn how to write grants on fetal alcohol syndrome." And so I said, "Sure, I'll do that." So I met up with someone from the Yankton Sioux tribe and in the Indian Health Service, and we writing grants are always a hair-raising experience of the last minute, doing things in the middle of the night and chasing federal X trucks down the road to get. Anyway, this included all of those events. It was horrendous. And lo and behold, we got.
Oh, it's so stressful.
Oh, it's just terrible. It's awful. But lo and behold, this one had a happy ending, and the community got a fair amount of money to attempt to to provide services to women who were approaching the Indian Health Services for prenatal care, and to embed within that prenatal care services that hopefully could prevent substance use during pregnancy and ultimately fetal alcohol syndrome.
Wow.
So I've done some other grants too. I've written a number of other grants for the Native community. One on preventing infant mortality, and another one on substance use among children through a mentoring program.
Think of the ripple effect of the grant you wrote about fetal alcohol syndrome. How much that could have changed a lot of trajectories.
Right. Sadly, what happens when you dig into fetal alcohol syndrome and its genesis and how it can be prevented, one quickly recognizes the complexity of substance use, especially in that community, probably any community, but particularly, this was in a reservation community. And probably one of the most significant findings that came from that was identification that the women who were drinking most heavily during pregnancy were also embedded in a household where there was a fair amount of domestic violence, and that they themselves were subject to that violence. And so you understand that you don't just, it's very complicated. And it's not just drinking during pregnancy, it's also surviving a violent domestic living situation. And how do you separate that out? And when drinking is a mode of social interaction, how do you sort that all out? The other thing we learned is the women just weren't having a drink after supper or with supper. The definition of drinking, as we came to understand it in that community, was becoming drunk. So there wasn't just a little bit of social drinking; it was drinking a great deal. So, what are the ripple effects? I think we have an understanding of that, but it's a very, very complicated situation and sad circumstance.
Speaking of Native American peoples, we were talking before the show about the definition of disability. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Right. Well, I now teach a course on the history of disabilities, and the first chapter of our textbook and some of the individuals I invite to class, it talks about pre-Columbian issues related to disability and perceptions of disability. And I think one of the most impressive comments within that was the understanding that among traditional Native American communities, indigenous people in our country, there was no definition of disability. The word doesn't exist in Native languages. Of course, I can't say that in a definitive way, although the Native people who are experts in it will tell you that. There are hundreds of Native languages. But if there's no definition, there's no word for disability, the whole concept of disability doesn't exist. The notion that does exist is that everyone has a place in a community, everyone has gifts. Those gifts vary, but there's a role for everyone. Everyone can do something, and everyone has a place. And so that concept helps us all understand that the notion of disability is constructed socially. We socially construct that idea. And it's interesting. It's intriguing to think, gosh, maybe there isn't such a thing as a disability. That just doesn't exist. It's just that we're all different.
Well, that's really interesting, and it's hard to comprehend too when you've lived in a paradigm, or at least for me, when I've lived in a paradigm of disability my whole life, and so but it's interesting to think the paradigm doesn't exist in some cultures.
Or the twist to that comes out in the course over time is who has the disability? Is it a person or is it the community? Is it the community that somehow doesn't adapt to everyone?
Who has a disability? Is it the person or the community? Speaking of people with various disabilities doing what they can, would you please talk a little about? You told me about the sit-in. It was like at the Department of Health and Human Services back in the 60s or something. I'm not getting the story right, but will you correct me on this story?
Yeah, sure. There are a number of stories, but I think the one that you're referring to was this incredible event that occurred in San Francisco. Does that sound right?
No, I think in Washington, D.C., there were a group of people who who took over a building at one point?
Yeah, that took place actually in San Francisco.
Okay,
No,
okay,
it's
yeah,
okay.
okay. I'm
That's
going to
okay.
be quiet and let you talk.
No, it doesn't matter. What happened in the 70s as part of the Rehab Act, which provides funds for rehabilitation services? The thought is some staffers, some people who were on the staff snuck in some language that went unrecognized. And the language essentially prohibited any agency that receives federal funds from discriminating against those with disabilities. It was a statement that was crafted after the civil rights legislation. So this was passed as legislation. And a number of people in the community that was advocating for those with disabilities got all excited when they saw this. But in order for a piece of legislation to have any teeth in it, rules have to be passed and signed off by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Then it was HEW, Health and Education Welfare. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen under the Ford administration. It was actually passed in Nixon, but it wasn't. In the Ford administration, it never got passed. And then Clinton became president, and he was dragging his feet, and Califano was the secretary of HEW, and he wouldn't sign these darn regulations. And the fear was that if the regulations didn't get signed, this piece of legislation would never have any teeth in it, and it would just disappear. It would have no meaning. So, those that had come to be the leaders in the field of disability rights got very agitated about this, and Califano would not sign them. And so they organized in the same way that the civil rights movement organized around nonviolent behavior, nonviolent protests, a national sit-in at the regional offices of HEW buildings, and that occurred. What was different in San Francisco is that in all these other regional offices, people went in and made a big fuss and created a lot of commotion and press and media attention, and then went home. The people in San Francisco didn't go home. They went up to Califano's office. He didn't even know what they were talking about. Not Califano's office, the regional director. I forget his name. It escapes me. But anyway, so the regional director, had all these people in his office clamoring for him to, why aren't you getting Califano to sign these regulations? And he didn't even know what they were talking about. At least that was the sense of it. Anyway, 5 o'clock came, he went home, and everyone else stayed. Staff all went home. And they stayed for 25 days. They didn't leave.
For 25
days. The longest
days.
sitting in a federal office in the history of our country. They didn't leave. They stayed.
How did they get food?
Well, that's the interesting part of the story. This is a fascinating story. I mean, here they are, and these are people with significant needs. They had major disabilities. There were blind people, there were deaf people, there were people with catheters, there were people that had all kinds of medical needs, seizures. I mean, they had a range of disabilities. Wow. Well, first of all, they learned how to take care of each other, which is interesting. Blind people were changing catheters, and it was just a very interesting way that they all came to help each other. But who fed them is even more interesting. It was the Black Panthers, the rather militant group of African Americans who were agitating for equal rights. They thought, well, these folks, are up against a problem too. We're going to feed them. So every night they would come in with huge serving trays of warm food. And the guards would just open the doors, and in would come the Black Panthers, and they would bring them food. And then Jerry Brown was the governor, and he arranged for plumbing to be provided so they could wash their hair. And it was very interesting how this all worked out. And several other progressive leaders in San Francisco took a liking to them, and the press kept following it. And then at one point, as I recall, they cut the phone lines. So here are all these people unable to communicate with the external world. Well, they had an interesting way of dealing with that. You want to figure out what they did? The deaf people leaned out the windows and used sign language, and their friends were out on the sidewalk. And so they had they had their own way of communicating. And so that's how all of that, got solved. And eventually a group of them got agitated enough that they decided they needed to go to Washington, D.C., and there was a hearing arranged in Washington, D.C. So they left. They elected who would go. They flew across country, and the Teamsters helped them at this point. So everyone got off the airplane except what they called the wheelchair people. And the Teamster guy came on and said, okay, we've got a van. They had a big rider van for all these people. And he said, the problem is we don't have any way of tying on your wheelchair. So anyway, they got him up on this van. And he said, but don't worry, I'm going to be getting the back of the van with you. That's one of my favorite lines from this whole history. He said, don't worry, I'll be in the back of the van with you. Well, they rolled around, and it turns out they went to Califano's house, and they had a big, midnight vigil. And, they kept waiting for him to go out the front door, but he didn't. He went out the back and drove to the office. And eventually, Carter just told Califano, sign the damn thing. And it was done. But it took 20. And the other interesting part of the story is that there was such bonding that occurred in that building among these people with various disabilities that when it was signed and there was a big celebration, they said, give us one more night. They wanted to stay together. They had such a positive feeling and a sense of their power and this new claimed ability to express themselves and support each other that they didn't want to leave, that they wanted another night together.
So this is the group back in San Francisco.
That was the group back, yeah.
Oh.
They didn't want, and then there's a wonderful, wonderful video of them leaving the building, successful in having accomplished what they wanted. But yeah, it's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story.
It's so inspiring. Often in life, it seems like things will never change, and people are up against huge odds that they can't overcome. But stories like this remind us that no, that's an illusion. When people gather and commit and are peaceful, so much can happen.
Right. It's a good story. It's a good story.
So we're wrapping up pretty quick, but I want to be sure to ask you a question I ask all my guests. So when I talk about doing a big thing in my business is talking about doing our imperfect best. And what that means to me is we envision the best we want in life. And then when mistakes and obstacles come up, instead of giving up and saying, oh, that vision isn't worthwhile, we learn from the mistakes and obstacles and keep going towards the best we envision. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you?
Oh, I feared that question was about to arrive, and I'm wondering. Such a good question because it's multiple. What is it? I think it's just getting up every day, starting again.
Getting up every day and starting again. That's a beautiful, beautiful definition of it. And then also, if people want to find out more about the work you do, where would you direct them to go?
I think probably the best place would be my email, my current email.
Do you want to get that out on the podcast?
Sure. I'm at the University of South Dakota, so it's just simple ann.wilson@usd.edu.
Good. So right there.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on
Oh, thank you.
and for all the work you do and just for standing up for kindness and standing up for some of the best that humanity has to offer. Thanks for being you.
Thank you, Jason.
Uh, um, I love my life and I love my job and talking to great people living their lives, extending themselves and creating wonderful things in the world is just it's so enjoyable. I encourage you to celebrate the people around you by asking them curious questions and getting the stories, and it's just so rewarding. And as you ask other people curious questions, that they'll hopefully start being more curious about your life too, and then that's just from being able to tell about your life. So too. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. And next week, who's on next week? Oh, next week, my friend Thomas Clue talking about mattering greatly, and he really talks about how we all matter in this life, and he has a powerful message. So please tune in next week. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and until next week.